All right, I think we're going to start now.
Okay, you are recording.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. We are very excited to have an opportunity to have a thoughtful conversation on issues regarding police reform and policing in general in our country. You know, in our Torah, in the portion that focuses on the creation of a just society, it begins, Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha. Appoint judges and officials for each of your tribes in every town the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall judge the people fairly. And so what we see is that judges and magistrates and shotrim are understood as police go hand in hand. In fact, in modern Hebrew, mishtara, based upon that word, is the word for police. And so the Torah reflects an understanding that those who administer the law and those who enforce the law must work hand in hand. And we all appreciate the fact that there is often a distance between theory and practice. And the Torah seems to understand that idea as well, because here in the book of Deuteronomy, when these issues are raised, there is an admonition given ostensibly to the judges and to the magistrates that says, Tzedek, Tzedek tirdof. Justice, O justice, will you pursue. That is the goal. That's the admonition to create a truly just and equitable society. And what's of interest is that the word justice is repeated. Justice, O justice, will you pursue. Now, some would say that that is just adding emphasis to the phrase. But there are other commentators that teach us this. Those who are in positions of trust, positions to administer justice in our society and to protect justice in our society, must use just means to achieve a just society. It's not enough to follow the law. One must also do it thoughtfully with justice and equity. And it is of note that Ruth Bader Ginsburg of blessed memory had those exact words on her desk. And I would suggest that that every judge should have it on their desk, and the police also would do well to put these words in their cars as well, because we all know and we understand what happens when justice does not prevail in a society, especially in the hands of those who are put in a position of public trust. People lose trust, and chaos can ensue. This conversation is taking place at an inflection point in our society. We have seen way too many videos to look the other way. But by the same token, we also appreciate the difficulty that those who are on police forces also face. This is a challenging time. And so the question is, how do we get there? How do we get to that biblical vision of a just society? What will it take for us to take the steps necessary? This is a topic that needs to be discussed, and we have to be able to have thoughtful conversations, hard conversations, and also thoughtful conversations, knowing that there are a whole variety of very different views represented on this call tonight. But if we can't discuss issues as a community, then we are failing as a community. And that's the goal of this evening, is to have a thoughtful conversation. And so this is the first of two. And at our next at our next gathering. We will also have representatives from the police force who will also share ideas. And then we're going to put all four of the speakers together for what promises to be a very, very important conversation. And we at Anshe Emet will do what we can to keep this conversation going. But we are very grateful to have, and I should mention that at our next session, Matthew Tobias will be one of the speakers. And I'm also hoping that Tamara Margolis, who is a member of our congregation and is also a lieutenant in the Chicago Police Department, will also take part in that conversation. But for tonight, we're going to be, we're privileged to hear from Adam Gross, as well as Desmon Yancy. And I want to just take a moment to tell you a little bit about them. Desmon Yancy is a remarkably experienced person who has been involved with community engagement, community outreach, public relations, campaign management, leadership development, lobbying, field team management, community organizing, and the list goes on. Most notably, he has served as Director of Racial Justice for Action Now, Director of Movement Politics for the Center for Race and Gender Equality, Workers Center for Racial Justice. He has served as Deputy Field Director for the Fair Tax Campaign. He has worked as Deputy Political Director at the 2015 Chicago municipal election as a contractor and as a field worker for voter registration and Raise Illinois GOTV project. And I should also mention that Desmon is from a police family. His father served as a Chicago policeman and also other relatives. And so, and Desmon Yancy is Director of Community Organizing with the Inner City Muslim Action Network. We also have Adam Gross, who is a member of our congregation. And we're very proud to welcome you tonight, Adam. He works professionally at the Business and Professional People for the Public Interest. Adam joined BPI in 1995, now directs BPI's Affordable Housing Program and its Justice Reform Program. Currently, Adam's housing work focuses on developing and building support for state and local policies to create and preserve affordable housing and to stabilize communities struggling to address vacant property challenges. Adam's justice reform work focuses on reducing the number of youth and adults in prison and jails in Illinois and improving services for people in the criminal justice system and leadership. And Adam also had a leadership role on the city's police accountability task force. Adam and Desmon both are actively involved in the work of police reform and GAPA, Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability. And I would be remiss if I didn't also note that Adam and his wife Mia are the parents of Molly, Naomi, and Rebecca. And so he has fulfilled that great important task of giving Barry and Merle grandchildren. And that's an important piece as well. So I want to acknowledge that before we even start. I also want to say that all questions that you put in the chat will only be seen by the speakers. We have received some questions beforehand, and I'm gonna be handling the questions a little later in our program. But I think that it's important as we begin tonight to talk about what our goals are, what we're thinking to do, why this is important, and where we want to go with this. This isn't a cable news station, right? We want to have a balanced and thoughtful conversation. And so as I welcome Desmon and Adam, I'm going to look to Adam to share just a few thoughts along with Desmon as to what our goals are tonight, and then we'll begin.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm going to leave this mostly for Desmon. We're going to have a conversation about police reform. These conversations are challenging. The stakes are very high, and so we always find it's valuable to keep the conversations rooted as much as possible in some shared principles and some shared understandings. And Desmon has some thoughts about that.
Sure. First, thank you all for having this conversation tonight. As folks have mentioned today, it's a very important conversation and timely. So I want to emphasize a couple things as we think about this conversation tonight. First, when we talk about policing and police reform, we should always keep in mind, in the front of our minds, that what we really care about is public safety. We want everyone, civilians and police officers, to go home at the end of the day and be safe at work and in their homes and in their communities. We might have different opinions on how to achieve these goals, but it's important to emphasize that we all share these goals and we all need to work together to advance them. Secondly, if we want to increase public safety, there's nothing more important than building trust. We need to build trust across a pretty big divide. Trust isn't just important because it makes us feel good. It's important because it keeps us safe. There's less crime and violence in communities where there's more trust in the police department. So here's one way you can see where trust makes a difference. In Chicago, most murders and almost all non-fatal shootings go unsolved. For homicides in Chicago in 2017, there were arrests in less than 20% of cases. If you killed someone in Chicago in 2017, there was a better than 4 in 5 chance that you wouldn't get caught. In Los Angeles that year, the rate was 73%. In New York, it was 85. The numbers are even worse for shootings where no one gets killed. In Chicago, in most years, fewer than 10% of non-fatal shootings result in an arrest. And many years, it hovers around 5%. Now, that's true for a lot of reasons, but if you talk to homicide detectives, they'll tell you that a huge part of the problem is the lack of trust. If the people don't trust the police, they don't talk to the police. And if the people don't talk to the police can't solve crimes. And if we really want to stop crime and stop violence before it happens, that is fundamentally about trust as well. One of the best tools we have for stopping violence is street outreach workers who do violence interruption. Violence interrupters aren't police officers, and many of them have been on the other side of the law at some point in their life. But they're in relationships with the people who are more likely to kill or be killed. And because of those trusting relationships, they get information about problems that could result in someone else getting hurt or killed. And they're able to step in and try to reduce the tensions, and that saves lives. They make the city safer. And the reason they're able to do this is because of trust. They're doing the job that police officers used to do. And frankly, it's a job that police officers still do, but they have a harder time doing it now because of the lack of trust. So when we talk about any particular police reform effort, we're talking about increasing public safety. And we should always ask ourselves whether a particular approach is likely to increase or decrease trust. More than anything else, that's what's missing now. And more than anything else, that's what we need.
Thank you. So let's get started. Police reform is a very hot topic right now. And we tend in this kind of this 24-hour news cycle that we live with to focus on the latest difficult, awful story that's in the news. But we live in Chicago, and we know that there's a long history for this conversation about police reform, both here in Chicago and around the country. So maybe we could start with a little bit of a historical context.
Sure. Thank you, Rabbi. The context is really critically important. It's the story and the experience that we all bring to these difficult discussions, and the unfortunate reality in Chicago and around the country is we bring different histories and different experiences to this particular work. It's impossible to talk about the history and the context for this work without talking about race. Most Black and white Americans live in very different social worlds. And in general, Black and white people have very different experiences with the police, and those inform these debates. Police misconduct and police violence is heavily concentrated in Black communities. Those are the same communities where unemployment is higher, income is lower, high school and college graduation rates are lower, the incidence of almost every healthcare problem is higher, life expectancy is lower, and on and on and on. And we created this world. Our laws and policies constructed a divided society. We can look at legalized slavery, Jim Crow laws, racial zoning restrictions, redlining, the federal highway program, the urban renewal program, exclusionary zoning, segregated school districts. Again, we could go on and on and on. All of those things helped to create the divisions that continue to tear us apart today. So our laws, our policies, our collective social actions have concentrated disadvantage in predominantly Black neighborhoods and concentrated opportunity in predominantly white neighborhoods. And those laws and policies have restricted access for Black folks from the white communities that offer the best opportunities. And because of that separation, there are still big differences in the day-to-day experiences of Black and white people. And what's more, for lots of American history, we have, in a variety of ways, used police to maintain the social division and the physical separation. So that's some of the history that lives with us. And the upshot is that anytime a police officer hurts or kills a Black person, I know there are many people who want to focus on the very specific facts of that one incident. And there are other people who are inclined to see that event in the context of hundreds of years of American history. So they'll connect the dots from the use of early police patrols to capture fugitive slaves, to Jim Crow era police departments that permitted or even encouraged lynching, to Arkansas state troopers who blocked Black children from desegregating schools in Little Rock, to the Alabama state troopers who released attack dogs and clubbed people marching for voting rights in Selma, to the Chicago police officer who shot Laquan McDonald 16 times, including shooting when he was lying dead or dying in the street, to a Minneapolis police officer with his hands in his pockets and his knee on George Floyd's neck. So all of that history infuses these debates, and that doesn't lead us to any conclusions about individual police officers or their behavior, but is, again, it's a history that we carry with us. I think it's also significant to note that that most Black people in Chicago today either came here during the Great Migration, or they're the descendants of people who came here during the Great Migration. So that's the period from around 1916, 1917 to 1970, when 6 million Black people moved from the South to the North to escape state-sponsored, state-sanctioned oppression and violence. So they really came as refugees, seeking freedom from violence, including violence at the hands of police. So again, against that background, we can understand that the stories in the news today resonate in a particular way, especially for some people, and feel like they're part of a very old story. And part of that story is also about the larger society's unwillingness to make change, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. There are lots of blue ribbon commissions that have written about policing in Chicago. The first was over 100 years ago, actually exactly 100 years ago. It was the summer of 1921. The vast majority of the recommendations from that report in 1921 were never adopted. A lot of the issues they wrote about are still very much with us today, and you see them reflected in things like more recent analyses, like the Police Accountability Task Force report that both Rabbi Siegel and I worked on, or a report from the US Department of Justice soon after that. So we have for certain made enormous progress. There's still lots of work to do, but we come to this present moment bearing the weight of that history. Just think of there's the great line from William Faulkner about the past is never dead. It's not even past. Right. That's the reality that we work in police reform.
So when you were speaking about separation, Adam, I couldn't help but think that Chicago has the distinction of being the second most segregated city in the country. And the first is not in the South, the first is Milwaukee. And so I imagine that plays a role here in your thinking, in some of the policing issues that are coming up.
It absolutely does. I mean, it affects everything, and certainly not just policing. It's not a problem that we're going to solve overnight. It's a problem that we built over generations, and that will be undone over generations. It's the work for our children and our grandchildren and our great grandchildren. I mention it just to say this is the reality that we bring into the present moment, and that we need always to keep top of mind, because that's so much of what shapes so many people's experience of the police department today.
Well, thank you for that. That history is very important, but let's come into the present. In the past few weeks, we've watched the trial of Derek Chauvin and saw the jury come back with its decision in regards to the murder of George Floyd. But while all this was going on, there were other deaths, killings around the country, challenging moments, other video, and including that of Adam Toledo here in Chicago. So Desmond, where do you think we are now? And how, if I can ask, what was your response to the Chauvin conviction?
It's interesting that it comes off as relief for many. Like, if I can be honest, I was nervous about this verdict because, it shouldn't have taken a 9-minute video and 3 weeks of testimony to get a guilty verdict. There have been, other cases across the country that folks have seen as clear-cut violations of civil rights, clear-cut crimes against innocent people, and yet they go unpunished by police. But I'll say that if we can call this justice, for the sake of this conversation, to have justice in one instance, right? Still, there's injustice throughout the system. I looked up the definition of justice as you were speaking earlier, and it says the maintenance or administration of what is just, especially by the impartial adjustment of conflicting claims or the assignment of merited rewards or punishments. And it's hard to think of the system of policing as just, as Adam described it, when it's built on these unjust values, right? But we need to focus on fixing the system, not just these incidents. So in the last few years, there have been a couple of big reports on policing in Chicago, and they both emphasized the need to fix system-wide problems. One was from the Police Accountability Task Force, which was chaired by Lori Lightfoot before she was mayor. And the second was from the U.S. Department of Justice. Both reports found that the use of excessive force is widespread and that police officers are more likely to use excessive force on Black and brown people. Most importantly, both reports said that bad officers are a big problem. But the system, the bigger problem is the broken system, right? The report focused on serious problems with policing, with training, with supervision, and with oversight and accountability. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just pass it over to Adam and let him talk about some of the specific examples that were highlighted in those two reports.
Sure. So Desmond mentioned a couple things. He talked about issues with policies. One prominent example that's been in the news a bunch lately is about a foot pursuit policy. What should police officers do when they're chasing someone on foot? We know that a lot of some of the most difficult encounters between police officers and civilians happen when someone is being chased. The DOJ report emphasized that foot pursuits are really risky for both police officers and civilians, and said this is precisely why we need a clear policy. There needs to be good guidance about what to do in those difficult situations. Certainly, police officers are going to have to make split-second decisions based on lots of things that happen in the moment, which can't be predicted, and there needs to be leeway in that regard. But for a long time, the Chicago Police Department has basically had no foot pursuit policy, no clear guidance about what to do in those situations. Nothing that spells out when foot pursuits are okay or how to carry them out. And there have been calls for the development of a policy like that for a long time, and now it looks like following the killing of Adam Toledo, following a foot pursuit, that there will finally be a foot pursuit policy. But it's been a long time coming, and there are other gaps.
What would a foot pursuit policy look like?
What would the specifics of the policy be?
Exactly. I mean, I'm interested. I think people would be interested in a little, and it hasn't been implemented. But what would you think would go into a foot pursuit policy?
So I have some thoughts of my own, but to be fair, I would defer to people who are expert on that question about what it would be important to include. I think there are a variety of things that have been talked about, like, for example, whether you should have a foot pursuit policy that involves only one police officer, or if there should always be two. What should the location of those police officers be relative to one another? Are there physical settings in which you shouldn't engage in a foot pursuit because the risk is too great? What sort of backup should you have when you enter into a foot pursuit? I don't know what the best answers are to those questions. We'd want to look at research and evidence, but it's important that we take all those things, process them, and figure out as best as possible what kind of guidance we can give to police officers so they can keep themselves safe and keep civilians as safe as possible in those naturally very dangerous circumstances.
Right. Well, okay. So let's move forward, because in some ways, at least on paper, we would think that we're moving very much in the right direction. anyone who's looked at the consent decree between the Illinois Attorney General's office and the city of Chicago, one would I think be pretty hopeful that we are signed on to do systematic reform. It is, right? It's the responsibility of governmental officials to follow through with this. So first of all, if you could explain what the consent decree is and whether or not it's succeeding at all, because you would think that that the consent decree would represent a huge step forward.
Yes, it's absolutely a huge step forward. It's something to be celebrated, and I think something we've seen in a bunch of jurisdictions around the country where there's been significant progress on the policing front. Consent decrees have been a huge force for change for the better. They haven't always worked well, and there are also plenty of stories where they haven't worked well. But I think there's some reasons to be encouraged about Chicago. So first, for the benefit of the several non-lawyers on the call, what's a consent decree? It's a legally binding agreement, in this case between the city of Chicago and the police department and the Illinois Attorney General's office, and it's enforced by a federal court. In this case, the United States Department of Justice had done an investigation of the city of Chicago. Those DOJ investigations usually led to consent decrees. In the case of the Department of Justice investigation of Chicago policing, shortly after the Department of Justice completed and published its report, Donald Trump was inaugurated and announced that his administration wasn't really that interested in doing this work at the federal level on police reform. So then Illinois Attorney General Lisa Madigan brought a federal lawsuit that was based on the Department of Justice report, and the Attorney General's office got the same kind of legally binding consent decree that the Department of Justice would have gotten. The consent decree itself lays out hundreds of changes that will need to be made over a period of time. It went into effect about 2 years ago, and it should bring about some giant-sized changes. It covers a lot of issues described to address many of the systemic challenges that the police department faces, including lots of stuff about training requirements, use of force policies, and a lot more. So it's been in place now for about 2 years. There's an independent monitor who is appointed by the judge, who reports on progress every few months. The bad news is that the independent monitor's reports have been pretty terrible. Chicago's really far behind. The city's missed a lot of deadlines. The slightly less bad news is that that's pretty common with consent decrees. You have decrees because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There are really big challenges, including internal challenges within the police department. The change is hard. It's especially difficult at the beginning because oftentimes you need to build sort of a lot of infrastructure within the police department to create and to sustain the reform, to create systems of accountability. And a lot of that needs to get built early on so they get behind on other deadlines. So we're behind, but some of that infrastructure is being built, and we'll need to look in the coming years. Consent decrees often last 7, 10, 12, 15 years. So we should pay careful attention all the time. And I imagine we'll see more progress a year from now, and hopefully significantly more 2 years from now, and then tons 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now.
So are you saying that the effort is being made, but it's slow going? and just takes time to build the structures to increase change? Or are you saying that compliance isn't being met? And if it's not being met, and people are dragging their feet, what needs to be done to increase compliance? And here I'm picking up on a question by some couple by the name of Barry and Merle Gross.
You should block their access. There is compliance to a degree. I don't know that there's an active effort not to comply, but it's difficult to comply, especially when you don't have sort of strong systems in place to build out reform. There are some cities that have large offices of reform management within their police department. There's something like that in Chicago that isn't as big as it is other places. The staff within the Chicago Police Department that develops policy is small relative to some other cities. That needs to be grown. And there's a culture within the police department that, to varying degrees, is resistant to change. That is certainly not true across the board. It is absolutely not true of every police officer or every person in a position of leadership. But those cultural challenges and impediments exist, and some of that is it takes years to work through. So it's a mix of building the systems and the infrastructure and changing hearts and minds, and in the best cases, consent decrees do all of that, but it takes time to do each piece of it, but then each piece builds on the other piece.
I want to I'm going to direct a question that's coming from the audience to you, Desmond. It says this is from Ari Fried. A lot of community organizing I've seen focuses on police training and retraining. Even so, that assumes people can learn their way out of racist behavior. What do communities believe is a reasonable expectation of training, and what are its reasonable limits?
Interesting question. So my area of experience in community organizing hasn't been around training, just some sort of clarification. I've been working with Adam since 2016, I think, to bring about this community, the Civilian Oversight Commission. And the idea behind the commission is really to have the community have some agency about how they're policed. I think with this conversation around training, I'm just going to go off the cuff here. I don't think it's as much about expectations, but let me sort of paint a picture, right? As we look at the killings of both Adam Toledo and the killing of Anthony Alvarez and the killing of the young sister, the same day as the George Floyd verdict, who had the knife in her hand and was attacking someone. Many of the people who have sided with police have said they did what they were trained to do. So with Anthony Toledo, like, what kind of police department do we want? Like, do we want a police department that is trained to kill a 13-year-old? Or do we want a police department that values the communities that they're working with, right? Can you train bias away? It's not my area of expertise, but I do know that when we're having these conversations about bias, when people understand it, they have a choice to make. And the choice is to continue down this blind road of bias or to actively work against it, right? And when we're talking about people who are armed with a badge and a gun and have not just the weight of one of the largest unions in the country behind them, but also laws that protect them from either mistakes or their bias, right? that it's about the entire system of policing that needs to be addressed, not specific issues around specific training. And then going back to Adam's point about policies, some of these policies, I mean, to have a police department, our Chicago Police Department's over 100 years old, but doesn't currently have a foot chase policy and hasn't had one for at least the last 100 years. However, I'm pretty certain, my dad, as a police officer working in the Harrison district in the 60s, had to engage in some foot chases, right? And so if we want our officers to be safe and our communities to be safe, we have to have a discussion about what safety is and let that sort of be the baseline. And then with safety, let's make sure it's safe for everyone and not just the people who are on the taxpayers' rolls.
Go ahead, Adam.
I'd add to that. I think that it's an astute question. I think there are definitely limitations to training. I think it's also the case that we always need to think about training as linked with larger systems of accountability. And I think that training plus accountability can make a real difference, and that things like underlying bias you can minimize the impact of any underlying bias with training and accountability. I think about the experience of Los Angeles. I'm certain many of us remember the video of the Rodney King beating in 1993 in Los Angeles. There were all kinds of challenges within the Los Angeles Police Department, as reflected in that incident. The Los Angeles Police Department has undergone a pretty dramatic transformation in the 28 or so years since that incident. I don't know that that there's a significant difference in the officers serving on the LAPD today compared to 1993. I do know that training has changed, and I do know that the accountability systems have changed. So I don't know. I don't believe that that police officers bring attitudes about people to their jobs that are any different than the rest of us. The question is, how does what you bring to the work play out? And through training and the ways in which we hold people accountable to the rules that are established for them, we've seen in LA and other places that you can really dramatically change outcomes.
So on the one hand, in other cities, there have been success, or greater success than what we're seeing in Chicago. And I think to be fair, we can all agree that it's been slow going in Chicago. Now, both of you have worked on systematic reform. And I think that one of the ideas that has been prominent in your work is to create a community oversight body for the Chicago Police Department. And look, if there's going to be a paradigm shift, then that's part of it, right? To involve the community in oversight and to really begin to change relationships that way, and to give the community a sense of, give the community a voice. So help us understand why you think this work is important. And I just have to say, as part of this topic, that it troubles me and I'll just use the privilege of the chair. It troubles me that if you look at the Jewish community's movement in Chicago, and you go to the South Side, you're going to see areas where that were once heavily populated by Jews. And so Jews were very much part of the white flight. And so we have to sort of own up to the fact that that movement created gaping holes and was part of the change in the city, right? And so when we talk about, the police and their relationship with the Black community and the Hispanic community, we also have to take a long, hard look at the Jewish community's relationship with the Black community, right? And how do we create greater, how do we create a bridge between the communities? This is also kind of an underlying part of this conversation. If there's going to be a paradigm shift, it has to take place not just within the police force, right? It's an easy place to look to, but there's a whole much larger conversation here. So if we want to talk about the idea of an oversight body, that's a small part of a very large puzzle. So I just, I'll end my sermon there, but I just want to put that out there. And Jen Tesher, made the point in the chat about the demographics of Jews, on this from the South side to the North side and all the rest. And I think it's something we needed to underscore here. So go ahead.
I'll jump in. And thank you for saying that. I actually grew up in one of those neighborhoods. I grew up in Calumet Heights, and my parents moved on to our block in 1971, I think February, March 1971, and they were the first or second Black family on that block. By the time I started kindergarten, there were 3 white families on the block. And my community was dotted with former synagogues that represent exactly what you speak about. So I definitely have a connection to that. With respect to the need for community oversight of the police department, people have been calling for community oversight for a long time. Go back almost, it'll be 55 years in August when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King marched in Marquette Park. And while he was there, he was not only marching about fair housing, but he also talked about the need for community oversight of the police department. So when we started talking to people, well, let me go back a little bit. So much of the focus has been on building trust between the police and the people they serve, just like we were talking about before. And the Police Accountability Task Force document really focused on building trust. As a matter of fact, one of its 3 biggest recommendations was to create a community oversight board for the police department. And as I talk about this, I want you to also think about the person who chaired this commission, who is now Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who sort of stands in the way of this work being brought to fruition. The task force laid out some broad ideas for what it thought the community board should do, and said that specific ideas should come from people and communities around the city. So a few months after the task force report came out, a bunch of community organizations came together to talk about the community oversight board idea. And eventually many of them came together as a coalition that we called the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, or GAPA. Over the next year, GAPA groups held dozens of meetings in neighborhoods all across the city, worked with a few thousand people, and we learned more about the existing system, what was working, what wasn't. And to do that, we talked with experts around the country, and we worked to design a community oversight system. GAPA leaders, again, made up of organizations from all across the city, focused on 2 of the things that we've already been talking about, which are building trust and systemic reform. As we worked to develop the system, we started looking at what oversight was already in place. So we have COPA, the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, which does independent investigations where there are allegations of police misconduct and tries to figure out what happened. And then we have the Police Board, which looks at the investigation and what it found, and decides whether there should be any punishment and what it should be. So COPA and the Police Board are all about punishing officers for misconduct after it's occurred. They aren't about working to fix systems that are consistently producing bad outcomes. They're more about highlighting or preventing bad apples, right? But if you look at their outcomes, it doesn't really do that either. But generally, they aren't about making the systemic reform that we talked about earlier. So what we sought to build was an infrastructure to create systemic reform. We wanted to do something that could do what the consent decree was doing, but even after the consent decree is over. What we created doesn't focus on punishing officers. It's mostly about getting better policies and practices in place and building trust and better relationships. One key piece of the proposal is that it gives civilians a big role in making police department policy. We don't usually think it's very controversial either. In pretty much every area of government, police have a say-so in how the government bodies make rules and regulations. But police departments usually make policy with little or no public input. Police department policy making is less transparent and less democratic than policy making in pretty much every other area of government. And just for perspective, the Chicago Police Department represents 40% of the city municipal budget. So we think that's a problem. Just like everything else the government does, we think police policies and reform plans should reflect public values and be informed by residents' experiences. Just like the rest of our democracy, we think that will produce better policies, and then that will lead to more public trust in the policies that are created. And so what we're doing is creating something that is more open and democratic, and believe that that's what's going to keep us much safer. We also wanted to create something that did a lot more to bring community members and police officers together, right? It's about building those relationships, and it's about creating a system that we all need to work together to increase public safety. And I think that's everybody's job and everybody's business, frankly.
Are there examples in other cities of community oversight that are working?
Sure. I'll let Adam talk a little bit more about it, but the LAPD commission is about a little over 100 years old. There were commissions that were created recently in Seattle and a couple of other cities. So this isn't anything new at all.
Right.
The LA system has been in place the longest. As Desmond said, it's been there for almost 100, or actually at this point over 100 years. What GAPA is proposing builds on that experience, but adds some stuff to it. And what they have in LA is an example of civilian oversight, which is a little different than community oversight. Civilian oversight is saying people who aren't police officers should play a role in this. Community oversight is focused more broadly on sort of how people come to the table and where it's a broader level of engagement. There are some examples of that more community-focused approach. A bunch of them have emerged as a result of consent decrees. So there's not the same kind of experience as we've had with some of the other civilian oversight bodies like in LA. And so it's harder to draw really clear, strong lessons just based on the lack of experience. So GAPA leaders sort of did the best they could, talking extensively to people in cities that have some of those programs in place. But the reality is a lot of this is stuff that we're all here in Chicago and around the country sorting out on the fly. We're sort of building a plane and flying it at the same time.
I want to just add a couple of questions here that are pertinent. Barry Seeskin is asking, we're dealing with budgetary issues. So, so I want to move into this whole question about what's unfortunately called, goes under the heading of defunding the police. But when we see the kind of, and this is Barry's question that'll lead into it, you see resource constraints, the dollars allocated from a strained fiscal condition, right? How do you balance all of those issues, and then and the need to the need to maintain public standards? How do you balance all this in understanding this call for defunding the police?
Well, budgets are moral documents, right? Cities put their money in what's important to them. And again, with 40% of the municipal budget going to the police department, that says a lot about how our city sees the role of police in our communities, right? It's kind of like overall. But again, thinking about what Adam said, white Americans, white Chicagoans, and Black and Latino Chicagoans live very different lives and have very different connections when it comes to police. Also, the defunding police movement gets misidentified in some ways because it's not about removing police from communities. It's about it's about reimagining the funds that are spent with police and using that moral compass to reimagine what policing looks like. Particularly, like for a common example is as we talk about mental health, people in crises, we call 911 and then the police show up. People with guns show up to deal with people in crisis. Like, that sounds like a bad idea today. It should have sounded like a bad idea 20 years ago. And for some reason, this is where we are. But what if we took the money that was allocated or reallocated from the closing of mental health facilities here in the city of Chicago and put more focus and more money into those sorts of programs, right? To prevent tense moments from becoming even more tense. And as we look time and time again, often ending up with someone dead. But to ground this a little bit, it's not so much about policing, it's about police reform, and it's about public safety, which is what we really care about. And policing is just one way to keep our families and neighborhoods and cities safe, right? We can be asking the questions, how can the police department do something better than they're doing now? Or how can we all be safer? Those are related, but they're not the same question. And if we focus all of our attention on the first question, how can the police departments do something better, we'll miss answers to the bigger and more important question, which is how can we keep our families and our cities safe? And so for some people, when they hear defunding, they mean they should think about the $115 billion we spend every year in America on policing and ask, what's the best way to use that money to keep ourselves safe? And when we talk about defunding, a lot of what we're saying is the same thing that many police officers have been saying for years, which is we send police officers to deal with substance abuse and homelessness and domestic disputes, even though that's not what they've signed up to do. They're not substance abuse counselors, psychologists, social workers, marriage counselors, and they don't have the tools or the training to deal with these sorts of issues. But we do give them guns and batons and handcuffs, and we send them out to engage these folks with sometimes undiagnosed mental illness or in the throes of some crises. And so the big part about defunding is about figuring out better ways to send the most qualified people to deal with a problem. And sometimes it involves a police officer, sometimes it involves a mental health expert, sometimes it might not, or sometimes it involves both. But the defunding conversation is about having better outcomes in the long run.
One of the things that I find really fascinating in the conversation about defunding, or in the conversations that I hope we can all have about defunding, and maybe we can continue the conversation in our next session in a few weeks, is that if you take folks sort of on the advocacy side who've been pushing for defunding and put them in one room and put a group of police officers in another room, they have a very similar diagnosis. Police officers have been saying for a long time, you call on us to do lots of things for which we aren't the most appropriate response, and you're not providing the training or the resources to deal with these issues. We put an extraordinary burden on police officers to take on a whole range of social ills. A lot of advocates for defunding are saying exactly the same thing. So I think it's really encouraging, and I think there might be lots of opportunity for productive conversation to sort of, bridge the divide and again work together. Where if we say the goal isn't police reform, the goal is public safety. What can we all be doing together to make our homes and our neighborhoods and our cities safer? I think there certainly shared values and lots of shared ideas about how to get from here to there.
Right, and I don't want to ignore the fact that there are issues that transcend the civilian population and the police population. Chicago is awash in guns, right? And so, Desmond, as you were talking about, a 911 call, right? We also are aware that guns are everywhere, right? They're just everywhere, and lots of places they shouldn't be. So when a 911 call comes in, how do we keep the social worker safe, right? I mean, those are real questions. And I just want to put it out there because it's because it is so complicated and there's so many factors that are impacting us here in Chicago that it's sometimes it kind of makes your head spin.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on, and that's why this conversation is important. It can't be a conversation where there are people who, a significant amount of people who have some concerns about the way their communities are policed, and the police saying, no, everything is fine. Like it's not fine. We're turning up the radio when our car is clunking, but we're not trying to figure out what the problem is and then working to resolve that problem.
Mm-hmm. I want to offer a question that Elaine Mosley raised. She asked, it's important to consider universal standards for hiring police officers. It starts with who you choose to serve and protect the community. The community must be involved in the screening, interviewing, and hiring practices. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's what we seek to do with the commission that we're creating, right? I understand that hiring practices for the Chicago Police Department are dated. The training is dated. There are too few conversations about the kind of people, about people who want to be police officers. I go back to, I believe it was 2017. I spoke to a group of high school or teenagers from 13 to 17 that attended, I believe it was Marshall High School on the West Side. And no, it was Austin Career Academy. And it was just Black boys, I'm sorry. And there were about maybe 75 during the course of the day, 3 different sessions. And in each group I asked, well, I had a long conversation about economics and, what's a fair wage to pay for a job, and what would you want as a 15-year-old kid, what kind of money you think is a lot of money to make, right? And so you hear something that's like $15 or $20 range, and then started talking about the role of police and police in the community, and talked about how much money, frankly, police officers make. Or you can make around $70,000 or $80,000 after 18 months on the force. That's a lot of money. And when you're talking about people in this community, that's life-changing money, right? Not one child wanted to be a police officer. Not one, right? And that says a lot about the talent pool. It says a lot about the work of the police. People know the work is important, but however, there isn't really a connection to wanting to be a police officer. My dad was a police officer. He was a police officer, worked in law enforcement for 39 years. Was at Chicago Police for 25. Was at Chicago Housing Authority for a few years and retired working with Lori Lightfoot at the Office of Emergency Management. I wanted to be a police officer for 5 minutes. And it wasn't anything, it wasn't that I didn't think it was a noble profession. It wasn't anything nefarious. I mean, I grew up in the 70s, so I had and I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood, and my dad was a cop and his friends were cops. So I had a different connection to law enforcement. However, it's important to, I had this conversation with a former colleague. Did you know that there are tests to determine if people have explicit bias for social workers? But that test doesn't exist for the police department.
Right.
Right.
And we know, like, any other profession, there are people who not only are, they carry racist beliefs, and people who are involved in extremist groups that also and so it speaks to the need. Do you have statistics? And this is a question for Barry Ballack on the percent of how many minority members are officers in the Chicago Police Department?
I don't have them, but I know they're low. There's a radio program I listen to almost daily, and they always report on new graduates from the Chicago Police Department. This is Black Talk Radio. And so we're trying to find out where the Black people are. And it's usually some single-digit number of cadets that are graduating that are African-American, typically a few more that are Latino, and then even fewer that are Asian, or Pacific Islander, right? Adam, do you know off the top of your head what the demographics are? And I'm going to try to Google it while you are asking or answering.
Not off the top of my head, but if you want, I can buy you some time with a related story. I'm remembering back around 2004, which was around the time I first had the good fortune to work with Matt Tobias when he was a commander on the West Side. And
Wait, can I just interrupt you really quickly? Just so everyone knows, Matt not only, and he will be hearing from Matt on the 27th, but Matt has a very distinguished career in the Chicago police force, as well as serving our country as a Marine, as did his father and his two sons. But I also want to mention that Matt is also head of security for Anshe Emet Synagogue and the Bernard Zell Anshe Emet Day School. So everybody just understands what Matt's role is. So go ahead. I'm sorry, Adam.
Thank you, Rabbi. So on the question about hiring standards, I think part of what the question gets at is that our thinking is changing about what it is we value in police officers, what we want to hire for. There are certain skills and traits that have been highly valued in policing for a long time, some of which are absolutely necessary today. And now we think, given some of the challenges that that Desmon said police officers deal with on a regular basis, we think need to be factored in to hiring. So this conversation that I had with another commander, someone almost as wise as Matt, who said the challenge is that he said, right now the police department is a hunter-gatherer society, and we need to become an agricultural society.
What does that mean exactly?
Had this idea that there's sort of this long history of police officers going out into dangerous situations and taking down animals and and bringing home food, and that the policing of the future, as this commander saw it, was much more about cultivation. It was rooted more in building relationships, of trust, taking the time to sort of feed and water those things, with the expectation over time that those would create networks, support networks, safety networks, information networks that would work to keep us all safe. But it's a very different mindset and a very different set of skills that you need to do that. As Desmon was saying earlier, now we expect police officers, or call on police officers, to do a million different things, even though we can't reasonably expect that there are going to be a whole lot of people who have all of the skills to do all of those different things. So one of the challenges as we think about hiring is to say, what are the different skill sets that we need? What are the things that we most value? How can police officers most effectively do their jobs to keep all of us and themselves safe? And what are the specific qualities and traits that are most likely to produce that? We don't have a fixed idea right now of what that is. There are conflicting ideas about it. So even to get to a place where you might have some uniform standards about hiring requires this conversation about what precisely it is we want police officers to do and what skills exactly they need to do what they want, what we want them to do.
Yeah, I found the demographic information. This is from an article from December of 2019, 2017 population data. So the department is 48% white. And this is, I'm also going to give you the city demographic. So the city is roughly 33% white. There are about 21% Black officers, represent a very similar percentage to white people, 30% Black in the city, and then 27% Latino. Are on the force with 29% of the city. And then the rest is Asian and other races. And so there's also an overrepresentation of white police officers on the department compared to the population. And that's not like, unlike at most major cities that are going through these still same sorts of issues around policing in the community.
It would, it would stand to reason that having more policemen of color and other minority groups would make a difference. And yet, does that trust exist in the Black community with Black police officers?
I don't think so, because again, it's the system, right? And so I have had negative experiences with Black police officers and white experiences. And white officers. I have colleagues and friends who have gone through similar. I'm a 50-year-old Black man who's lived in Chicago all but 3 years of my life. And so, and most of that on the South side of Chicago. And the community I grew up in the 70s, again, and late 70s and to late 80s, there were a lot of police officers in my neighborhood. My dad was a cop. There was a gentleman across the street who was a detective. A man on the corner was a state police officer. On the next block over, there were husband and wife police officers. And there were a lot of Black police officers that worked in my community. And I remember an incident where me and some friends were playing football in the street, like most kids at 16 years old. And one of our neighbors called the police on us. Police officer showed up. He was a Black officer. He said, "Hey, I just want to let you know, one of your neighbors called the police on you. Let's not make a big deal about this." He talked to us in like a really cool and down to earth way. And then just suggested we go to a park just to keep the peace, right? I've had other experiences that didn't go the same way. And so I think having officers that are more representative of the city, and then trying to break this segregation that exists in our city, right? It's the tribalness, that the othering that we do that prevents us from actually seeing each other's humanity. And so something that I and my friends often talk about is how, take the Anshe Emet Young raid, for example, right? There is no way that a person who's not a police officer saw that everything that happened in the videos that we saw as appropriate, right? However, a week and a half ago, I was listening to a radio show with John Catanzara, who is the president of the Federation of Police Lodge that represents Chicago police officers, who said that the officers acted reasonably for police officers, right?
Okay.
That's the conversation that we need to have, right? Police officers don't live in another world. They live in the same world we live in. They go to the same grocery stores and they go to the same bars and worship in our same houses of worship, but you don't have to be a different being just because you have this role in society, right?
Okay, well, since you brought it up, let's talk about the police union and what effect do you think that has? I think you kind of opened the door to that, Desmond. Adam, do you want to add to that?
There's a lot that I could say. I imagine we could have a very robust conversation about this when we have friends from the police department and who've served on the police department in the conversation as well. I think historically in Chicago and elsewhere, police unions have often been impediments to reform, and have worked even to incorporate into their contracts provisions that make it more difficult to hold police officers accountable. It's all sort of in the interest of giving police officers a fair shake. but I think that there's, sorry, we're about to be joined by a cat.
Okay.
Um,
So here's what, let me make a suggestion. Let's save this part of the conversation to the 27th when we can talk about this. Sorry, look at my tail for a second there.
Can I though add one thing to what Desmond was saying on the question about the racial composition of the police department? I think that's certainly an important issue. It's an area where Chicago and other cities need to do more work, and virtually everybody acknowledges that. I also think if we go back to some of the fundamentals that we're talking about building trust and building relationships, there's a lot of good stuff that can happen across boundaries of race. I think when some of us think back about experiences with police officers in what feels like ancient history, we think about beat officers, police officers who are out walking the streets and building relationships. That happens less today than it did historically. We have a lot of police officers who spend a lot of time now in cars responding to calls, and their jobs are structured in a way where it's harder for them to get out and build relationships. That means that you sometimes have police officers who work from late at night to early in the morning in communities where they don't have a lot of historical experience, and they're there at times when it's difficult to build relationships. There's a program that's being built out in Chicago now based on a similar program in New York that's designed to get more officers out on the street, engaging with people, building relationships, out of their cars. And they're finding in Chicago, as they did in New York, that it really makes a difference, that you can do a lot more to break down these barriers and to build trust and to increase public safety, the more that you can just bring people together, and that's proven true without regard to race. So that's not to say that race isn't important, but there's a lot more that we can be doing to get over some of the challenges that racial difference and racial tension creates.
Alice Ginsberg asks, what part do gangs in Chicago play in the police force's approach to policing?
That's not my area of expertise, but what I will say is that there have been some concerns from police and some law enforcement experts about the way that at least Superintendent Brown has been approaching the issue of gang violence in the city. This sort of it's a system that hasn't worked in the past and isn't working now, where you're just sort of throwing a bunch of manpower at this issue. I saw something, I believe it was in the Tribune today or yesterday, Adam, the ShotSpotter article. So there's this technology that the city of Chicago uses called ShotSpotter. It's high-powered microphones and cameras that pick up the sound of gunshots and then send officers to the location. It sounds pretty dangerous to me, right? Officers are going in with this heightened sense and moving into a particularly tense situation. However, some 60 to 70% of those calls result in nothing. There's a lot going on in terms of gangs in Chicago, and there's a lot historically that has been done by I'd say the police department and others that have made combating this issue extremely difficult. There's, not to give you all too much, but there's some history about the El Rukins and the Disciples that talk about in the 90s as the war on drugs began to break up gangs. those two gangs in Chicago, which are like the key, have been decentralized. Their leadership is decentralized. And so it's not really large organizations of young people. They're much smaller organizations of young people who have no connection to anything other than their own, what they've deemed a connection to. And so I don't know what exactly the role of police should be in resolving this issue. However, sending a bunch of police officers into a Black community and, stopping and frisking Black kids isn't going to resolve the issue. Those beat cops that Adam talked about, even Eddie Johnson talked about this when he was a police officer, when he was in charge of the police department. Most of the police know most of the people that are doing most of the killing, most of the shooting, creating most of the havoc in our communities. And so if we hear this, and then we go back to something I said very early on, that, if you shoot someone in the city of Chicago, you have like less than 5% or somewhere between 5 and 10% of those cases are resolved through the judicial system. There's some sort of disconnect that's happening that is much deeper than the conversation that we could have today.
One of the things we haven't mentioned is the need for more work to be done for the mental health of police officers. I have a great deal of involvement with an organization out of Israel that works on post-traumatic stress disorder. Pastor Harris and I have been doing a lot of work in that area to train pastors in this area. This organization, Natal, has also been working with police forces around the country to help with PTSD on police forces. What has been a little discouraging to me is that I'm on the board of Natal. I've gone and tried to move this issue forward with the Chicago Police Department, and I haven't gotten very far. But I do think that is also an issue that needs to be addressed along the way. Because as Adam, as you were saying, police are being called upon for a whole variety of things that can make your head spin. And that's a challenge. I want to, Matt, do you have a question that you want to ask before, because we're going to run out of time pretty soon, but if you had a question that you wanted to ask Desmond and Adam, because you're going to have plenty of time in the weeks to come, but I thought, you know what, if you want to, I'm more than happy to, they'll be more than happy to, speaking on their behalf, to entertain a question.
Sure. So I don't actually have a question. I have very much enjoyed this time. I wholeheartedly subscribe to the idea of seek first to understand, then to be understood. And it's been very helpful for me to hear what you have to say. And so many of the things that I'm hearing both of you gentlemen say, there's a lot more commonality. There's a lot more police officers that would agree with many of the things you say. And what's really nice is you can find out that you agree on 70% of the stuff. And if we can take care of that, then we can do the hard work of that 30%, but that 30% is going to be a real bear. But yeah, so I don't have a specific question other than I have enjoyed what you gentlemen have had to offer tonight. And I do look forward to 2 weeks from now, or 3 weeks, whatever.
3 weeks from now.
3 weeks from now. And yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a question.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. And by the way, that was a very nice, uplifting thing to hear. So thank you for that. I'm going to give the last question to Jackie Gilbert, because, and she asked this question earlier in the day, and I wanted to put it out there because, we talk about, we're talking about one area of Chicago, but her question, I think, speaks volumes. What ideas are available to involve the young, disaffected people to feel that they have a stake in society, right? That gives them the desire to go to school, right? To have a place within the larger system. And I want you guys to offer an answer to that as well, because there are so many issues that we are facing right now. And I work as part of the clergy with the mayor's office, and we're trying to work on a whole slew of social justice issues. But I think this is a good question to end with, because it speaks to the greatness of the issues that we're facing. Do you guys have a thought on that?
I have lots of thoughts. I have, one of my roommates is 17 years old, one of my roommates is 16, and one of my roommates is 14. And they and their friends and their cohort maybe give me more hope for the future on this issue and all over other issues than anything else. Just the way in which we've seen young people getting engaged around issues of police reform, climate change, gun violence. It's really extraordinary and inspiring. And I think there are enormous opportunities there. We've done some work at GAPA with young people through different organizations, including the Mikveh Challenge, which is a Chicago-based program that engages with kids in schools around the city, around a whole range of issues. And there's enormous interest among young people in getting their hands dirty, in stepping into these conversations and figuring out ways to help. So I have 100 different ideas about specific ways to do that. I think big picture, the answer is we just need to keep on creating those opportunities at every turn and on every issue for young people to engage meaningfully. There's such great desire among young people to do this work, such great ideas and such great spirit. And then picking up on what Matt Tobias said earlier, once you can get into conversations about stuff, there is so much overlap, so many shared views and goals that I think just creating opportunities for young people to get directly involved with people who are doing the work day to day, building the relationships, offering ideas, helping to turn their ideas into realities, that will ultimately be our path out.
Thank you, Adam.
Can I just add
I
something?
want to give you the last word here.
Yeah, I'll just add something about the youth. First thing is, if you want to engage youth, make sure it's young people around. I'm 50. I haven't been to youth in a long, long time. And so it's really important to make sure that we're, like to Adam said, that we're creating the space to have these conversations. And I think the other thing to mention is just like times are really different. I heard a statistic that said, in the 60s or 70s, children identified as under 18 experienced some 1 to 2 traumatic experiences in their life up to that point. But if you look at today, that number is in the hundreds of thousands, because you take video games and you take television and you take community violence and the news and all these sorts of things. Like, there is a level of stress that children are under today that you could probably say is unparalleled. And then when you take a look at kids in the Black community, if we're thinking about officers who are patrolling in these tough communities have PTSD, what about the people who live there? I was 22, I believe, 22 or 23 before I lost my first friend to gun violence. I taught kindergarten in 1996 and had several kids who had lost multiple people to gun violence before they were 7 years old. And that is multiplying even today. So it's really just understanding the weight that they're bearing. Like, if kids are in their teens and are bearing, dozens of classmates over their teenage years, there isn't really much hope for a future, because the future that they see around them doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. And so we also have to make sure that we're working to create a future that kids want. And so when I hear about teenagers who were fighting for more than $15 an hour, while at 16 I was making $3.35. Life is different. And these are the kids that are waking up and saying that stuff that y'all dealt with was unacceptable, and it's for you, and it shouldn't be acceptable for me. And so again, it's like, what is the world that, as in organizing, a question I often ask people in rooms like this is, if you had a magic wand, what would you create? And I think that if we ask these kids what they would create with a magic wand and listen to them, not just like in a passive way, but really active listening, and then worked with them to create that world, then they would feel more value on their time here.
Desmond, Adam, thank you so very much. We look forward to getting together again on the 27th. And Amy, thank you for putting all this together. I wish everyone a good night.
Thank you all.
Rabbi. Thank you all.